My name's Tim Driscoll and I'm an Associate Professor in the School of Public Health in Epidemiology, and my specialty area is particularly occupational medicine and occupational environmental medicine. And I'm planning to talk to you today about cancer clusters, particularly in the setting of workplace, but the concepts I'm going to talk about are relevant to other areas as well. So I'm planning to give you an overview of what clusters are, talk about some of the issues that are related to investigating them, talk about some approaches that are used or that you can use if you want, and give you a couple of examples to try to illustrate those. So firstly, let's think about what's a cancer cluster, or more generally, what's a cluster. And there's quite a few definitions, but basically it just means a higher number or a higher rate of cases than you would expect based on whatever the background rate is. So to do with cancer, we're talking about an unusually high number or rate of cancers. Now, sometimes it's focused on a whole range of cancers. Sometimes it's just focused on one particular type of cancer, and I'll talk a little bit about the relevance of that later on. Now, a few concepts about cancer itself. Unfortunately, cancer is a common disease. Probably about 1 in 3 women and 1 in 2 men will be diagnosed with some form of cancer during their lifetime. Most forms of cancer are more common with age. Most have a long latency, and the latency is the period of time between exposure and when a cancer is diagnosed as a result of that exposure. Usually has one or more risk factors. Sometimes they're known, sometimes they're not well known, sometimes they're not known at all. And there's a random aspect to cancer. So although there are known risk factors, there's definitely a random component. So 2 people could have very similar exposures, very similar genetics, and one might get cancer and another mightn't. One might get a cancer now, one might get it in 5 years' time. So although there are known risk factors, there is this random component to it. Now, it's tricky to know whether, if a lot of cases of cancer have occurred, what they're due to and whether that's a problem, for a number of reasons. Some of them I've already mentioned. So most cancers can be caused by more than one exposure. So if you see a case of cancer, it's difficult to know exactly what it was due to. Even if you could pin it down to an exposure, the same exposure can occur in a number of different places, so you don't necessarily know where it occurred or when it occurred. So the long latency makes it quite difficult to know when, and also often where, or even if there was such an exposure, because this latency is not just a month or a year. Typically it's 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, sometimes even longer years. So it's hard to find that connection between exposure and cancer. And there's usually no way to tell in an individual case what the cause was. So if you had somebody who had cancer of the lung and you took out a bit of tissue, there's no test that you can do on that cancerous tissue to tell what the cause of it was. Okay, to distract you in case you get a little bit bored during my talk, I've got a few photos of my holidays that I go each year in Hawk's Nest. So as I said, if you get a bit bored, you can look at the photos. So first I want to illustrate something with a very crude diagram that I've put together. Let's presume that these are all the workplaces across somewhere, let's say across Australia. And these dots are random cases of cancer that occur in people. And they're random because I just close my eyes and drop them with the mouse. Let's look a bit more closely. So let's say there are some workplaces in here. There's a workplace with 7 cases of cancer. And here's another workplace with no cases of cancer. And here's another workplace with 1 case of cancer. Well, in the workplace with no cases of cancer, people aren't going to think about that. In the workplace where there's only 1 case of cancer, probably nobody would think to connect that to work. Even if there was a connection, probably people wouldn't think about it. But where there's 7 cases, wouldn't be surprising if people are looking around thinking, well, this is odd. I know people who work in workplaces where there's no cases of cancer, we've got all these cases, there must be a problem here. And the tricky bit with a cancer cluster is to say, well, firstly, are there more cases than you would expect? And secondly, if there are, has this just occurred at random because of this random aspect of cancer? Or is this truly due to some problem in the workplace that needs to be fixed? And something I should mention with this is that Cancer does occur randomly, and randomly doesn't mean spread out evenly. So if you take a bag of marbles and you chuck them on the floor, they're not all going to spread out evenly. There'll be some in clumps and some that are not in clumps, just through chance. And that's what happens with diseases like cancer as well. So the tricky bit is working out, if you see a pattern, has that pattern occurred due to chance, or is that pattern reflecting some underlying problem in exposure? Okay, so a few concepts about clusters that you need to know. Let's look at when do concerns arise. So when do people get worried about it? Typically it happens if there are concerning exposures, so if they know they work in a workplace that's got a cancer-causing exposure, if the cancer is of an unusual type, if it involves young people, if people have raised concerns and they've been dismissed and not given appropriate consideration. And it's not uncommon that in the background, when issues of possible cancer cluster arise, that there are industrial relation issues or community issues or some other problem that's helped to bring it to the surface. Not always, of course. So that's when they do arise. Now let's look at, well, when should they arise? When should you be worried about it? Should it be on the number of cases, the type of cancers, the people affected, the exposures there? Well, this is my take on it. You need more than a few cases, because if you've only got a few cases, you just can't make sense of it. There's really nothing to investigate. So you've got to have more than just one or two cases, nearly always. In terms of the type of cancers, I'd be more concerned if they were rare or unusual types of cancers rather than common cancers. Doesn't mean that common cancers can't be caused by workplace problems, but it's much more likely that it's just going to be a chance occurrence if the cancers are the normal type. If they're all the same type, that's a bit more of a concern than if there are a whole lot of different types of cancer. Because usually if you've got a problem in the workplace, you've got a cancer-causing exposure in the workplace or the community, it's not going to result in a whole lot of different types of cancers. Occasionally it might be possible, but that would be unusual. I'd be more worried if it affected young people than older people, because cancer is more common in older people, so you shouldn't be as surprised if cancer occurs. It's much more likely that, again, it's just through normal risk factors and just due to chance, not due to issues in the workplace if it's in older people. And in terms of the types of exposures, if you have a workplace where there are no known carcinogenic exposures, so cancer-causing exposures, it's very unlikely that there's going to be a problem. Not impossible, and you should still look, but I'd be much less worried in that situation than if I knew that there were cancer-causing exposures in the community, especially if those cancers were known to be connected, if those exposures were known to be connected to the particular cancers that were occurring in the workplace. But there's a lot of challenges with investigating these. First, there's commonly a lack of information about exposure. Remember I said that typically there's a latency of 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years. So you've got to be looking back then. If you want to know if cancers now were caused by exposures, you need to look back 10, 20, 30 years to get the information. And often it's not around. There's often uncertainty about case definition. So people might say everybody's getting cancer in our workplace, but when you look into it, it's not clear. They might have been including cases that actually weren't cancer. They might have been benign tumours. They might have been including people who had worked a long time ago, and that might be appropriate, but sometimes it's not appropriate to do that. So it can be tricky to work out who should be included and what sort of cancer should be included. It's hard to find everybody. If we're going to look, say, over a 20-year period, it could be hard to find all the cases that occurred. And it's connected to that, it's uncertain who's the population at risk. Is it people who are currently working, people who have ever worked? There's a whole range of definitions that you can have, and although you might think it's straightforward, it's often not straightforward. One of the biggest problems is the statistics. Typical statistics, when you hear of a p-value and a probability that something's occurred, they are based on an assumption that you've taken a group at random from a bigger population, you've chosen them at random, you look at them and you say, well, how different is this group from this other group? And you look at the difference, and there are statistics that can tell you the probability that you'll get a difference of a certain size. But those statistics assume you've taken a population at random. And that's not what happens in a cancer cluster. We take a population that we think has a high rate, and we go and look at the rate and we compare it to, say, the population average. And in that situation, because you haven't taken the population at random, you can't use the normal statistics. And a lot of people don't understand that. And it's tricky because not only can you not use the normal statistics, there are no statistics really that deal with it well. There are things you can try, but none that deal with that very well. So usually people want to know, what's the rate of cancer? Is it different to what we would expect, and how unlikely is that? So they want a rate calculated and a probability calculated. And I think most of the time that's an invalid thing to do. Sometimes you have to do it, but the interpretation is very tricky. There's often a public perception that there must be a problem, and so that makes it tricky. If you don't find a problem, people have often invested a lot of emotion in there being a problem. It's often arisen, I talked about the context, you've got to really understand the context of the way things arise. There are sometimes other agendas, industrial relations agendas, for example. That's not to mean that it mightn't be a real thing that's raised, but you have to keep that in mind. And it's often tricky to investigate because of ethics restrictions and ethics requirements. It can be hard to get the information that ideally you would like. Now, what should you do? Well, I would say whatever you do, you try and do it quickly. Start quickly anyway. So you have to have a prompt response. I think you have to explain to the people who are concerned the challenges, just like I have then, perhaps in a bit more depth. There should be an emphasis, I think, on the exposures and the case characteristics, not just the rate. You should involve all interested parties, and I like to establish a reference group so that they can be consulted by me, but also they can feed information back to the concerned people so that everybody feels that they've had at least a chance to have their problems raised. And you need to give regular feedback to them so they know what's going on. I think you should have a two-stage approach. One is looking at the exposures, and remember you should be focusing on the past exposures, but often you're forced to look at the current exposures and then try to work out, well, how might these be different to what they were in the past, or the same as what they were in the past? And it's reasonable to do some sort of epidemiological analysis of the cancer cases, but remember what I said, that calculating the rate is often not a very useful thing to do. Sometimes it is, but often it isn't, and it's very hard to interpret properly. And usually you're doing both of these stages at the same time. You need to communicate very well what you're doing throughout, especially because it can take a long time. Now I want to take you through a couple of principles. The first one, if there are no concerning exposures, but you find a high rate, so you go to a workplace, you look really well, you're very confident that there's no exposure problem there that you're aware of, but you find a high rate, almost certainly that high rate was due to chance, because there's nothing there to cause the higher rate. Either that, or there's some exposure that nobody knows about, nobody's identified before, that's caused this high rate of cancer. That's very, very unlikely. So that's the first thing. If you are still concerned, so you don't find exposures, but you do find a high rate and you're still concerned, what you need to do is to go to another workplace that has similar sorts of exposures, so the people are conducting similar sort of work, and look there. And if you find other workplaces that also have high rates, well, then you start to get concerned, because then you have chosen somewhere at random. And if using the statistics, it still shows you've got a higher rate than you would expect, then you'd start to get concerned. But if you go to these other workplaces and their rates are the same, then it's unlikely that there's going to be a problem. The second principle is, if the rate's not high, but there are exposures of concern that you find, then you should fix them anyway. It doesn't matter what the rate is. If you go into a workplace and you find that there's asbestos or benzene, you don't wait around to see what the rate of cancer, a particular type of cancer is, and if it's not high, don't worry about the exposures. You fix them anyway. So that's why I'm saying focusing on the exposures is the best thing to do, because if you don't find worrying exposures, that should be reassuring. And if you do find worrying exposures, you should fix them. And both of those decisions you can make without knowing the rate. Third thing is, when people have concerns about clusters, they nearly always turn out to be not a problem, not related to the workplace or the community where they work. But you can't just dismiss them, because if you dismiss them without looking into it, people are still worried. So in fact, you still do have a problem then. You've got people who are concerned about going to work or concerned to be living in the community when they don't need to be. Probably, and if they do need to be, well, you need to sort that out. So you need to look. You shouldn't dismiss it without looking. I'll keep going through there. Okay, just to give you a little bit of background, there's been a range of famous so-called cancer clusters. Some people argue whether these really are clusters or not, but I think you can argue that they are. So chimney sweeps and scrotal cancer hadn't been described before. I guess it's about the late 1700s, 1800s. Vinyl chloride causing angiosarcoma of the liver, very rare cancer. Asbestos and mesothelioma wasn't known until late 50s, early 60s. And more recently, Kaposi sarcoma, which again is a rare tumour, but was seen much more commonly with HIV infection. Oh, sorry. Just need to tell you a couple of things about what causes cancer. So there's an international agency, IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, and they're the international body that basically says something causes cancer or it doesn't. And they've got a number of levels based on information in humans, information in animals. Group 1 is something that's been decided definitely causes cancer. Group 2A probably causes cancer. Group 2B possibly does. Group 3 can't tell because there's not enough evidence. Group 4 doesn't. There's hardly anything in Group 4 because IARC doesn't look at things that probably don't cause cancer. They only look at things that people have become concerned about. So just remember that. Group 1 are the definites and Group 2 are the probable and possible. Now, I was going to give you 2 cases, but I'll probably just give you one. And a lot of you would have heard about the issue about the ABC Toowong building in Brisbane. I want to take you through that. I wasn't involved in that investigation, but I know it pretty well, and there's a published report, and the information I'm giving you today is all from that published report. So in terms of background, there were concerned staff because there were a number of women who'd developed breast cancer, and they worked together, most of them, and they were fairly young. They spoke to management, and they perceived that management had been a bit slow to react, and I think, reading between the lines, probably management hadn't been sure what to do. In the end, they went to the Queensland Health Department, I think it was, and they did an investigation. And it was a very epidemiological-based investigation to calculate the rate, but the risk factors, or the main risk factors for breast cancer, are all personal. So when women's periods start, how many children they had, did they breastfeed, how much do they drink, what's their family history. So the women had gone to management saying, we think there's a problem at work. And what they perceived happened is suddenly it was put back on them, and they were being asked, well, when did you start menstruating and how much do you drink? And they were feeling that it was all put back on them and the workplace wasn't looked at all. And not surprisingly, they weren't too happy about it. Now, in terms of external risk factors for breast cancer that might be associated with work, there's really only ionising radiation, which is not common in any Australian workplace. There's a few, but not many. And possibly shift work. So shift work is an IARC Group 2A carcinogen. But it's not known whether it's a problem, for sure, whether it's a problem. So what the ABC did when the women became more concerned, and clearly there was a problem that needed to be sorted out. Remember, I said you should never ignore these. You need to look at it seriously. They got a group led by Professor Bruce Armstrong involved, and that group set up a reference group, reviewed the relevant literature, interviewed the women, not just about themselves, but about their work and the workplace, what they did, as well as the known risk factors for breast cancer. They did calculate a rate of breast cancer, and I agreed with that approach because it would have been very hard given the situation not to calculate it. The issue is the interpretation of it. And they looked for the exposures. What they found was 10 women diagnosed with breast cancer whilst working at Toowong, many of them in younger women, and the rate was 6 times higher than expected. So that's high. And I don't know if you remember, but when it was released, the big headlines were 1 in a million, because the normal statistics had been done to calculate what was the probability of this occurring, and it was saying, well, the probability is about 1 in a million. But that was wrong, because the probabilities you can't apply. And the team knew that, and they tried doing some adjustment, and on the basis of that adjustment, the adjusted probability was 1 in 25. Now that's still not high, but you still can't hang your hat on that one, and you can see the difference between 1 in 25 and 1 in a million in terms of the emotive effect. There was a suggestion of increasing risk with increasing length of employment. Now that's something that you might be a bit concerned about, because increasing risk with increasing length of employment, if there's a problem at work, you'd expect more exposure the longer you'd work there. But still, it's pretty soft. And most importantly, there were no exposures of concern, and they looked really hard. So, they concluded there was a real increase in breast cancer rate, so the rate in these women was high. But it was very unlikely to be due to any exposure there, and probably that they identified, unlikely to be due to personal risk factors. But remember, there's this random component of breast cancer, of all cancers. They excluded all possible environmental associations that they could think of, and they didn't think there was anything else that could be done to provide more information. So here we're in this situation. Remember I said with the first principle, you've got a high rate but no exposures. If you're still concerned, you need to go somewhere else. So what they said, if you want to look more, go and have a look in the other ABC offices. They're doing the same jobs. Pick them at random, go and have a look at them. And that's what was done. This team didn't do it, another team did it. And we'll go and have a look at that. But the building was abandoned. Okay, so no exposures but a high rate, and they left the building. And we might want to discuss, well, what would you have done? The follow-up study was done, where they looked at all the other ABC offices, and this had much lower publicity, and nothing was found. So it's very likely, it's not absolutely certain, but in my mind it's very likely that what occurred in Brisbane was a chance occurrence. And this suggests that pretty strongly. Now, I was going to show you then an investigation that I'd done at the National Gallery. I'm not going to go through the detail because of time, but just to give you a few things. Same background, there were concerned staff, and the staff felt that management hadn't taken them seriously initially. And again, it was probably that the management really wasn't sure what to do. I was asked to come in and look at it, and basically we had a very good look, and we didn't find any problem exposures, apart from possibly diesel. I'm just going to skim through this. Here are the exposures that were at the National Gallery at some time in the previous 30 years, or 25 years. They are all the IARC Group 1 carcinogens. They are the 2A, so the probable, and they are the 2B, so the possible. So it's not that there weren't any cancer-causing exposures potentially there, but they're all small and we felt well controlled, apart from diesel, because that came into the loading dock. There were trucks coming in, diesel trucks, into a loading dock that was enclosed, and the trucks were supposed to turn off their engines and they didn't. So there were people who were unnecessarily exposed down there. We had those levels measured, and really they probably weren't much higher than if you stand on a corner and a truck goes past. So they probably weren't a big issue, but they were higher than they should have been. They didn't have to be there if they had a proper designed loading dock. So we found lots of carcinogens, but none that we thought were a problem. We thought it was very unlikely that there were any cancers that were related to work. We didn't think anything else was needed. We suggested they redesign the loading dock, and the gallery didn't mind that because they were about to demolish that part of the building anyway and rebuild the loading dock, not because of what we had said, it was already planned. So that worked, and I didn't know that at the time, but I was glad it happened and it was easy for them to do, and there have been no further issues. So let's compare those two places, the ABC and the National Gallery. Staff were dissatisfied in both. In the ABC there was just the one type, breast cancer. In the National Gallery I didn't say there were quite a number of different types. There was not one type that was a real problem. Both types, or all the cancers involved, were common types of cancer, not rare. ABC had young people involved. National Gallery, they were of the typical age. There was a high rate found at the ABC, but not a high rate found at the National Gallery, but there were no worrying exposures found in either. And the ABC moved, and the National Gallery, fortunately for my reputation and career, stayed. And think about the principles that I've brought up today, and what would you have done? Were they appropriate decisions or not? How could that have been handled differently or better? Now, just before I finish, I just want you to keep in mind the fact that usually when people are concerned about cancer clusters, it's because they're concerned about cancer. There's often this issue of uncertainty about cancer clusters, but there's a lot of things that people can do if they want to. It's tricky. You have to be careful if you're involved in investigation that you don't put up this slide right at the beginning and say, well, look, forget about cancer in your workplace, why don't you go and exercise more? Because that's not what the investigation should be about. But it's worthwhile reminding people that there are things, if they're concerned, there are things they can do that we know will decrease the risk of cancer. Not surprising. Stop smoking, exercise, eat well, try not to be overweight, don't drink too much, and when you go out in the sun, make sure you cover up. They're messages everybody would have heard, but they're all very important, basic public health, cancer prevention messages, and things that people can do. So, in conclusion, remember, cancer is a common disease. You're going to see it around a lot, and because of the random component of it, it'll occur in clusters some of the time. You expect the clusters just through random variation. They're very, very unusually caused by occupational or environmental exposures. It's not impossible, and you should always look, but it's very rare. It's even rarer that they'll be due to something that we don't know. So I've had people say, well, you haven't found any exposures, but how do you know there isn't something that you don't know about? And in the end, I have to say, well, look, I don't know that there's something that I don't know about because I don't know about it. But it would be very, very unusual for there to be an exposure that no one's seen before to suddenly turn up in a workplace that's not different to anywhere else. So that's very, very unlikely. Nevertheless, you shouldn't dismiss people's concerns because people don't get concerned lightly. You should sit down, discuss it with them. Sometimes that's all it requires, but sometimes it requires a big investigation. And you need to communicate well. Respond promptly. I think explain the challenges. People can deal with that uncertainty. And the emphasis should be on the exposures and the case characteristics, not just on the rates. Involve everybody who wants to get involved and give them regular feedback. And that's it. Thank you very much.